Welcome back to our channel. It's been a little while. This is our 2014 Keystone Toy Hauler, and we've recently had some suspension problems, which is very common with RVs. Let me show you. That is not right. If you have leaf springs on your towable and put more than 20 or 30,000 miles on it, you're going to have this problem, no matter what you do. Our Keystone came with 5,200 pound axles, and when it was brand new, I loaded it up with water, our Goldwing motorcycle in the back, hooked it up, went to Flying J scales and had it weighed, and we were underweight. There was nothing overweight anywhere. In 2017, a cross-country trip, we bent the rear axle. So at that point, I bought 7,000 pound axles to put underneath it, and upgraded the springs. The springs were rated at 2,600 pounds times 2. That's 5,200 pounds for the axles. But I upgraded to 3,000 pound axles, which was way more than I needed, thinking that I would not have a broken leaf spring. But now I've got about 32,000 miles on the upgraded springs, and one of them broke. This is the third time I've had a leaf spring break on an RV. And I don't know why. Probably because they're all made in China. They're made as cheap as they possibly can be to barely meet the weight rating for an RV. But you would think getting larger springs than you would ever need would do it. But no, the larger capacity spring, all they do is they add another leaf. They don't make the metal any thicker. And so it breaks right here, just above the second leaf underneath it. Like that. It doesn't matter how many leaves you have down here, it still breaks right there. Our Keystone came with this type of suspension, the CRE3000, but our RV has got close to 70,000 miles on it, so I'm just going to replace everything. One of the springs broke, so I'm just going to replace all 4. When you do that, you need new U-bolts because apparently they stretch a little. I'm going to replace all my wet bolts with another kit that's cheap enough to do that. It's not a big deal. Another thing we did when the unit was new is we replaced the antique magnetic brakes with disc brakes, and I've been really happy with them. The only trouble I'm having is I've got about 25,000 miles on the brakes, and the outer pad of all 4 calipers is wearing thin. These are new. I'm just showing you what they look like new. So probably have a rusty or dirty caliper bolt. So we're just going to replace all that while we're at it too. So let's get started. Okay, it turns out that I lied about how long the springs lasted. I checked my notes, and I have a blog on my personal website about replacing the old brakes with the disc brakes, and I did the springs at the same time. And I'll put a link to that in the description of the video if you want to go back and read about switching out the old style brakes for disc brakes. It's a pretty good write-up talking about the bearings and the axles, different weight ratings and so forth. There's a lot of good information there. So these springs have about 55,000 miles on them. So they lasted longer than I thought. But that brake was the third brake that I've had with leaf springs. We had a Wildcat before, put about 80,000 miles on it, and I had 2 instances of broken spring leaves. So if you put a lot of miles on your RV, you're going to have trouble. Like I said, this thing came with CRE3000s, but with about 63,000 miles on this 5th wheel, I'm just going to replace everything. All the shackles, all the bolts, the equalizer. This rubber is probably getting pretty old. It's about 10 years old. It came with the camper. This is a 2014 model. So what I want to do is I'm going to do each hub one at a time. I'm going to take the hub off, clean out the bearings, repack the bearings, inspect them, put new brake pads on the calipers, clean the calipers, make sure everything is sliding back and forth like it should. And the problem I just hit is there's 2 caliper bolts. One is down below the spring leaf. The other one is right across from the spring leaf, and I can't get my wrench in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the U-bolts off and just let the axle drop down, because I want to do all 4 hubs and disc brakes at one time and get that back together, and then do the springs all at one time. I have the camper up on blocks, and it's certainly very safe, but I always like having a backup. So I've got a block underneath the axle where the U-bolts are, just in case So I want to do all the work that I can while those blocks are in place. Anyway, it's perfectly safe. I'm not worried about it, but I just want to, once I get my head into doing the bearings, I'm getting old and forgetful. I want to get into a routine, do all 4 hubs, bearings, get the preload correct, the disc brakes, do all that maintenance, and have all that done on all 4, because I can do that and leave the springs and everything intact. And then I'll jump in and do all the springs at one time. It'll work better for me. Here's something I purchased recently. It's about 80 bucks. A YouTuber I watched, Captain Kleeman, had one, and I decided I wanted one. When you're working on these axles, you're going to be lifting the axle up and down a little bit to get the shackle bolts to line up again, to get the U-bolts in. You're going to have to move the axle up and down. It's not heavy, but you have to lift it up and down. And in the past, I've done that with 2x4s, with maybe a floor jack. This thing is a little airbag jack. It gets down pretty low. And this is a 3-ton jack, and I like it because it's got this handle. I can push it underneath. I don't have to crawl, and I control the inflation and deflation right here at the handle. I really love the thing. So I'm going to slide this underneath the axle, take the U-bolts out, and drop the axle down, and take off the caliper. Okay, I've taken the U-bolts off. The axle is dropped down on my little air jack, and I got the second caliper bolt out. Then the brake caliper slides up, no big deal. And I don't know if you can see, I'll take it out, but the inner pad is not even half wore out, but the outer pad is worn out. So I've got to figure out what's going on there. Good morning. It's another day of working on Vicky the toy hauler. Let me show you what we've done. I've repacked the bearings in both of these 2 hubs, replaced the grease seal, clean the calipers, and replace the brake pads. I still don't know why the outer pad wore out quicker than the inner pad. Everything seems to move freely. I'll just have to keep an eye on that. When I'm finished with everything, I'm going to come back and bleed the brake lines. I'll probably let quite a bit of fluid flow through, try to get fresh fluid in the lines, because I did this about 10 years ago, so that brake fluid's getting pretty old. What I'm going to do now is, this is the axle that broke on me, the eye broke off before a recent camping trip, and I took one of the old leaf springs that I tossed in the woods and put it back on. So it's a 2,600 pound spring. That's what it came with originally. 5,200 pound axle, so 2 of these make 5,200 pounds. I'm replacing it with a 3,000 pound spring, which is what I had before, which is the one that broke. I'm going to do all 4 of these. One thing I'm going to do, years ago I purchased something and never used them, called Never Fail bushings. And their claim to fame is that they never fail. The problem with the nylon bushings, or any bushing really, the spring eye does not make a smooth circle. Where the spring is bent around and it comes back, there's a little gap right there. And nylon bushings just wear out quickly anyway. But even the brass bushings, they only last a few thousand miles because of that little gap. The brass is brittle. It goes into the gap, starts cracking, and then it's over with. These never fails claim to be stronger and I guess more pliable. I did some research on the internet, and some people said they weren't any better than the nylon or brass bushings. Some people said that they did pretty well. I know the brass bushings will be gone at 3,000 or 4,000 miles, same as the nylon, so I'm going to try the Never Fails. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drive that nylon insert out, replace it with the Never Fail. You can probably do that with a bolt or something, but I've got this little nifty seal driver kit. I'll just pick the correct size that will catch the nylon bushing and push it through without getting stuck. So I'm going to do that. And there's nothing really tricky about this. These springs, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, but I've read that this little clamp should be in the front. Other than that, I don't think there's a front and a rear. When you take the bolts off, be careful with the impact wrench. On the back of the bolt, there are splines, and I don't know if you can see it in this new one here, close up. There's splines that lock it into that piece of metal on the back side. And you don't want those splines to spin in that bracket because that lets the bolt start turning and starts wearing out the hole. So as you're taking it, if it's very tight, I'm going to take a wrench and hold the bolt on the back and take these off carefully. And then when I put them in, you have to drive this bolt back in to where the spline's fully engaged, and this nut will not, the nut will not pull it far enough back. So just simply get an old socket you don't care about that you can put over this thing where you don't mess up the zerk, and drive it in until the spline's engaged. Other than that, it's just a matter of the torque. I have the wet bolt kit upgrade from MORryde, and they tell you in there how tight to torque the bolts, these hanger bolts. I think they're 80 foot-pounds. I know my new U-bolts say to tighten them between 65 and 75 foot-pounds. So we're going to do the spring, the hangers. I'm going to replace that guy, and then I'll do the other one also. All right, got the axle off, got the equalizer off. Here's the old equalizer, and as I suspected, the weight bearing part of the brass bushing is gone. And this is what's left of one of them. That goes to the spring shackle. Not much left of that guy. And I don't even see the one on the other side. It's completely gone. So yeah, brass bushings sound like a neat idea, but in the long run, they're not much better than the nylon bushings. But the best thing you can do is to get the wet bolt kit anyway, because you get these much thicker shackles. These are never going to give you any trouble. The standard ones that come from the factory are criminal. They'll make it maybe 10,000 miles, and then it will elongate and the end will break off. You notice these haven't been greased in a long time because I knew the bushings were gone anyway, and the holes are still perfectly fine. They're not elongated at all. And this equalizer thing, this hole is not elongated, it's fine. So mechanically, except for the brass bushings, about 50, no, this has got 65,000 miles on this guy right here. And it would have kept going. Now, one thing I didn't mention is when you put these bolts back in, these are greasable. Let me get one that doesn't have the bearing. These are greasable, of course, with the zerk, and there's a hole that the grease comes out of. And the book says to put that hole at 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock so that it will take grease with weight on the axle. If you put them straight up, the hole straight up or straight down, it's going to be difficult to get grease in there. So this said 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock. All right, let's put it back together. The job is complete, except I've got to torque everything. Like I said, these were 65 to 75. These are 80 foot-pounds. I think that's it. I got to get on the back side and drive the bolts to where the spline's engaged. So on the U-bolts, you want to make sure these are perfectly vertical. So I just hold them with my finger as I'm snugging up the bolt. You don't want the bottom to be out toward the rotor or the other one toward the inside, because they will get loose over time. And the only other thing I've tried to do is make sure both of these shackles are folded to the top. You can put this together with the spring down underneath and the shackle hanging down, but that's not the correct way that these normally hang when the tires are on. I think I did that once before, and I was able to jack up the camper, and with a pry bar, pry one axle back to make it go over center. I don't know, I remember it being kind of a pain in the butt. Try to get these lined up correctly on top. And that does it for curbside. All right, the job is complete. Let me show you the finished product. I've got 3,000 pound leaf springs. I've got new U-bolts and the plate. New brake pads. I've repacked the grease in the hubs. I've cleaned the bearings out. I clean everything. I use brake cleaner to clean both bearings and the inside of the hub. And I've got Timken bearings, and I've got 50,000 plus miles on them, and they're still fine. I did the MORryde wet bolt kit, and I replaced the CR3000. So the MORryde CR3000 came on the camper, and I just replaced it. And I'll show you the old one. But first, look at the rubber. This is the rubber. There's no weight on it right now. But this is the rubber compression part that allows it to spring up and down. And here's the old one. And you'll see the rubber was still pretty good. It was compressed a little bit under weight, but it still had a lot of life. And to give them credit, The brass bushing here and here was not worn through. It was still okay. This one bears a lot of weight, and it was worn out at the bottom, but I had not greased these things in a long time because I knew that these brass bushings, because of the spring eye that's not a complete circle, I knew those were gone, so I just stopped greasing this stuff. But this would have been fine for another 40,000-50,000 miles. But if you're taking the time to do this kind of work, just replace everything. That way you know it's good and you're not worrying about it. Now the bushings here and here, I put I think they were called Never Fail. I bought those years and years ago from eTrailer when they were available and never installed them. The original manufacturer does not make them anymore, but I understand you can find them on eBay. And one guy claimed that there's a fellow that still makes them. I don't know. But I did not grease that one or that one because I have the Never Fail bushings and I want to see how they behave. But I left the brass bushing here, here, and here. So I did grease the 3 of those. So this is not a difficult job if you're a little bit of a do-it-yourselfer. Just be sure to jack the camper up and support it with blocks or something where it's safe. And you can't support it under the axles because all this will be disconnected. You have to support it under the frame, which I've done on both sides. It really wasn't that big a deal. So what did it cost me? These springs, 4 springs, 3,000 pound rated, made in China. I couldn't find anything that was not made in China. 5 leaf, 4 of those were $120. The U-bolts were $33 per axle, so 33 times 2. The wet bolt kit from MORryde was $117, and 2 of these was $176. Now, if you get this, there's a CR3000, a CR4000, and there's a couple of different widths depending on the distance between, I think, that and that. But there's instructions for ordering the correct part, and I did. I know that I had 64,000 miles on this, so I can get another 64,000 or more. My only weak link in all of this is the stinking spring leaves. In 40 to 50,000 miles, a spring leaf is going to break right there or right there. And I know I have to replace the outer brake pads. Well, just replace the brake pads at around 25 to 30,000. So the only maintenance is really brake pads and spring leaves at 50, brake pads around 25. About every 25,000 miles, I'll take the hubs apart and check the bearings. Just visually inspect them, clean them really good, and visually inspect them. Make sure there's no pitting. The reason I have Timken bearings is around 2020, I've taken the hubs off and to clean the bearings. And when I cleaned them up, first, the grease was very dark, almost black. And it had been red, I think, when I last redid the bearings. So the grease was very black. And then when I cleaned the bearings, they were very pitted. They had little holes in them. And these bearings were made in China. So I decided, no, I'm not going to deal with that. So I got Timken bearings. It's probably more than $200 to do that. But I feel very good about that. And it wasn't that big a deal. You just have to drive the races out of the hub. And that's not that big a deal. And I won't go into the details on that. But it's not that big a deal. There it is, the final product. I'm going to put the tires on it and take her for a drag and check the brakes, make sure everything is okay. I have an infrared heat thermometer that I'll keep shooting these hubs and rotors to make sure that a brake pad is not sticking or that a bearing is overheating, but I think everything will be fine. So that's it, the great suspension maintenance task of 2024.